Well, thanks very much for inviting me here to speak amongst such esteemed colleagues and wonderful speakers. And it was lovely to hear Paul House. I had the pleasure of sitting with Matilda recently at the celebration to remember the wonderful Dr. Gordon Briscoe, who made such a big contribution here to the ANU in the history department. This is going. Oh, it's going to. I should have just. Are we? Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So, so history is calling. That's a very interesting term. And as you know, I'm sort of interested in the theme of deep history, which I think is very relevant to this voice. However, sadly, I think the history wars continue. I sort of hoped they were over, because I noticed that Keith Windshuttle wasn't arguing that there weren't massacres anymore. And when I worked for the National Museum from the year 2000 on, the whole place, which was the first National Museum dedicated to Australian history, was beleaguered, endlessly having to pretend that there weren't massacres really, because John Howard's appointees on the council of the museum didn't want to believe that. But then when we did have a symposium about the frontier wars, they were very keen to talk about guns, their guns quite often. So anyway, when I had the honour to come to the ANU and start up the Australian Centre for Indigenous History, I decided that I didn't want to get involved in the history wars, which were totally raging, because I could see so many historians checking over their footnotes and defending their work. And I thought, no, we've got to move on to new things and new ways of thinking about history. So I was really interested to explore Indigenous modes of historical practice, and as you know, more recently, to think about what a continent, a shared land that we live on, what kind of history that can have if humans, Indigenous Australians, have been living on this land for what we now say is 65,000 years. According to science, as they say in the Uluru Statement from the Heart. So when anyone asks about dividing Australia, I think our history is divided, because part of it happened 250 years and ongoing, and the rest of it did happen through millennia, through continental change, the coast changing, the shape of the continent changing. So anyway, this morning, we see the history war still raging, of course, in the Australian. And although I vowed never to get involved in the history wars, I was asked to comment about Blaney's latest arguments, which seem to be mainly about having a fight with Bruce Pascoe. But in fact, he's instead targeting the Yurok. And as you know, the Australian has been attacking everything about the voice, and if you open more pages, and I didn't buy it, I read it in the street cafe, every second page is something attacking the voice or attacking this, and this page after page. And so, as you know, that I think what Peter, you said about the Murdoch's press is unfortunately a very powerful weapon in all this. We'll go to the next. And it doesn't really matter what you say. They put, Geoffrey Blaney's 93. I'm not ageist, but, they keep bringing out Geoffrey Blaney to, on a race issue, any race issue, because they know that he'll attack. Anyhow. So I did write an article called A Yes for the Voice, Helping to Fix What is Broken, for the Academy of Humanities. And I stick by that. I think that the current situation is broken. Every year in Parliament we find out the terrible ways in which it is broken, because the Closing the Gap report shows that the gap is not closed. Like in terms of lifespan, it's 9 years less for Aboriginal people throughout Australia. A decade ago it was a bit more than that, 12 years. But, this, in fact, everybody's living longer now. So, it's really atrocious. Infant birth rates, terrible. Child mortality, still terrible. So as far as I'm concerned, there's a lot that's broken, and the Voice is trying to promise a way forward. So it is such a sad thing that it's nothing like the 1967 referendum, where the yes for Aborigines was the slogan was right wrongs, right yes for Aborigines. And even the Liberal Prime Minister Robert Menzies, of course, backed it after Kath Walker Udjuru Nunakal told him he'd be in jail for offering a whiskey to her, being an Aboriginal person, if he was in Queensland. And this seemed to wake him up to the idea of unequal human rights for Aborigines, because clearly his whiskies were very important to him. And then in the Republic referendum of 1999, that was a case of terrible division along political lines. And the No campaign argued that the Constitution was this sacred thing. It was wonderful. We shouldn't change it because it works and it's secure and we're this wonderful nation. And the slogan was, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And as we know, the No's won. Consequently, in the Australian Constitution, the King holds the final say over so many matters of our nation. And the Crown, the British monarch, is also the King now of Australia, and the Crown is mentioned 6 times. I do think that, in terms of history and the history wars, as I said, I thought they were over, but they just continue to rage, which I think is a very sad thing for Australia. And it's a sad thing that someone of the calibre and the diplomacy skills and the genius of William Cooper was ignored, that he gathered that very big petition. Back then it was a big petition of 1,814 signatures arguing for political representation and rights for Aboriginal people. And it was meant for the King, and the Australian government did not send it to the King. The reason because Aboriginal people were not included as a Commonwealth responsibility under the Constitution. And as we know, there's a Yirrkala Bark petition, which is actually up in Parliament House, the Barunga Statement of 1988. Hawke was promising a treaty, then the mining lobby got to him. And anyway, it's a very sad tale in many ways. In the 1980s, Jerry Hand asked me to go on this ALP subcommittee, and he was really, he'd been lobbied by so many Aboriginal women who were concerned about what's happening to the kids, and the stolen children were still going on. And he wanted Aboriginal people to have a voice, and he was successful in setting up ATSIC. And as we know, it did not continue, and then there was the National Congress. We know that none of them were continued. So clearly there are some problems with finding a representative body across the whole of Australia when there are so many Indigenous nations and different politics, but there's a problem with representing non-Aboriginal people across Australia in Parliament as well. But, it was this lack of will that didn't see those organisations continued and funded. And actually Amanda Vanstone said she regretted dismantling ATSIC. And I think that that's got us in this mess today. Like, if there was still an ATSIC, it wouldn't be considered so controversial a thing to have a voice ratified by the Constitution. And of course, in the Uluru Statement, the order of the day was voice, treaty, truth. So those people who argue treaty first, well, they obviously did not agree with that statement in the first place. And there are, in fact, treaties happening at state levels all over Australia, and they'll take a lot of time. They'll take many, many years, because if it's a good consultation, and hopefully they will happen. And like in Queensland, they've been given millions and millions of dollars to make sure that treaty process is really done well. And so it is just a shame that so many Aboriginal people don't support the voice, because they're arguing for treaty instead, when that treaty could happen under the voice. So the Fair Australia campaign, with Jacinta Namatjuta Price and Warren Mundine, who apparently is soon going to get pre-selection. If you listened to the radio this morning, it was pretty obvious. Marissa Payne is going to retire, and he's going to get pre-selected. So that's a nice prize for him, doing this campaign for so long. But when you think of history, you think of a society that was deeply, starkly divided. I mean, not only did Aboriginal people not have the vote for so long in many, many places, they also were under special legislation. The state was their guardian. Their children were taken off them. They didn't receive equal wages. They had to have all their land taken away. They were murdered on frontier violence. They were kidnapped. And you know, to now say this is going to cause social division if they have a voice is quite ridiculous when you think of how they actually had to hold a passport to travel. It was very similar to someone belonging to a different country or to go interstate. They had to show permission from the Chief Protector of Aboriginal people. They had to have exemption certificates to have the rights to go to a pub or to get their own wages in many states and in the Northern Territory. And, you know, you all know that story, I guess. So I guess what I would argue is that if Aboriginal people had a voice, would the Australian powers that be been able to wreak all that horror on the Aboriginal family? Intermarriage was actually banned. You had to get special permission, and it was usually refused. And so I thought it was somewhat strange that Jacinta Price was arguing about social division, and she's married to a Scotsman, and he actually doesn't have a bad voice. I listened to him, he sings and plays guitar and so on, which I thought was a little bit ironic, but what she probably doesn't realise, she's saying that the voice will run a line down her family and divide her family. And it's basically, I think it's ignoring the fact that for most of our history, Aboriginal families did have this line drawn through the families. And there's very, very many lovely and poignant love stories of Aboriginal people crossing the whole continent to try to stay with their beloved because their marriage was banned, their union was banned. And yeah, so as for social division, it's a strange argument. And I guess Peter Yu told us, who was saying where they were born? Oh no, it was Paul House. He said that he was born in the old Canberra Hospital. Well, I was born in the Royal Brisbane Hospital, and I grew up in Crown Street, and across the road was Empress Terrace, and it sort of went on and on. Everything was named after a royal. So, you know, it's this whole thing of asserting sovereignty. And Kira's wearing a lovely T-shirt saying we never ceded sovereignty. And so I think there's so many ingrained aspects of our history that we ignore. But fortunately, Aboriginal people did survive, and so did a lot of the names of places. And I think that there's going to be a lot more Indigenous naming and renaming in the future, which reminds us of the fact that we are on Aboriginal land and there's this very, very long, deep history. So it's, I guess, to me, it's a terrible thing that this referendum is divisive, but also that Parliament, being this oppositional system that we have, is creating this double division in society. And I suppose the other thing is that you're constantly reminded people just don't know the history. And we think people do know it because we've been writing so much about it since the 1970s. But I guess there has been a lot of progress. There has been Mabo, there has been native title, there have been land rights. So we've got to hold on to the fact that now Aboriginal people really do have rights. at the same time, I was talking to this woman who was wearing a Yes badge in Brisbane, and I got talking to her about the voice, and it was really quite frightening to talk to her. It was actually an exhibition about stock work, and she had written to Julie and Lisa and got replies, and she'd been writing to people and being very active, and she says, I'm from Warwick, and I've been talking to the people of Warwick, which is in Queensland, not that far from Brisbane, but it's definitely country Queensland. And she said, they don't want Aboriginal people to get any more rights because they think they have too many rights and think they have more rights than them. And this is like the frontier's last stand, she said. They don't like to hear about the massacres and all this. And this is their, nostalgia about the old history. And let's hold on to that and not give them any more rights. So she found that very frightening, and so did I. But to conclude, I'd say that if Aboriginal people had had a voice, hopefully a lot of those horrors of the past would not happen. And so if they do have a voice, hopefully some of those horrors will not be happening so much in the future. And as we know, it was a very gentle invitation, voice, treaty, truth. And yes, Aboriginal people were arguing a special case because of their long, long history and nurturing and caring for the land. Their language is far from divisive. It's a call to unite. It offers plenty of heart. It's an invitation, an opportunity in our time to create greater parity for every young child, a step towards the right kind of fairness. So even if it's awkward, I urge you all historians to try to educate a no voter and try and point out history, and also to point out that so many esteemed, amazing Aboriginal people have worked so hard and long for this, including our colleague Jackie Huggins, and we should believe in what they've decided is a good thing and back them for it. Thank you.